It was a snowy evening when I pulled into the parking area of the fuel station where I was assigned the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I had been at this job for several months. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but finding a different job was challenging, and due to other circumstances in my life, working nights suited my schedule best. Nonetheless, I always arrived feeling exhausted and struggled to stay awake through each shift. I parked next to the only other vehicle in the lot, which belonged to my colleague. I went inside and took over from him. He departed a few minutes later, leaving me alone for the rest of the night. My supervisor had left a note on the counter with some tasks to complete, but after reviewing it, it didn't seem like much. I guessed it would take no more than an hour to finish everything, so I tried to delay the tasks to avoid dozing off once fatigue set in. Around midnight, a car pulled into the station. I glanced out the window and saw an old SUV parked by one of the pumps. Given the snowy conditions, most people weren't out driving, but occasional customers were normal. I went back to my phone, browsing through videos and not paying much attention for about 10 minutes until I looked outside again and saw the SUV still there by the pump. The headlights were off and the doors were closed, as if someone were pumping gas. But it had been so long. I stood up and approached the window, looking down both sides of the building, but there was no one outside. If they had been in their car with it off for the past 10 minutes, they had to be freezing. It was snowy, windy, and cold, so I became concerned for them. I watched more closely for the next few minutes, waiting for any movement through the dark windows or for someone to get back inside their car, but there was nothing. It was as if the car had been abandoned next to the pump. After some thought, I put on my jacket and went outside. Immediately, I knew I was right. It was too cold for anyone to be in there with the car off or to be outside for more than a few minutes. I hurried over to the car, looked around, then peered into the window. "Hello? Anyone in there?" "Just checking if you're okay," I called out, but from what I could see, there was no one inside. It wasn't easy to see, so someone could have been there, but I was pretty sure there wasn't. Now even more confused, I backed up and looked around the empty gas station parking lot before starting to walk back. Not focusing on the car, I noticed shoe prints in the snow leading toward the building, not quite to the front but off to the side. I looked back and saw that the prints seemed to come from the car, but I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without warming up first. I went back inside and turned on the small heater next to the counter, putting my hands in front of it to warm them up. I was only inside for 30 seconds to a minute before I heard a thump echo through the building from behind me. I spun around, not seeing anything, then walked around the counter. In the back, on the floor, there were puddles of dirty water, like snow that had melted off someone's boots. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I stepped closer to the back room and turned the corner toward the supply room. Standing in the dark behind one of the shelves was the outline of a figure. They were tall with broad shoulders and had a large scruffy beard, and they were looking right at me. My heart skipped a beat, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to walk back to the counter. I don't know why. Maybe I was too stunned to react appropriately. After staring at the doorway to the supply room for I don't know how long, I quietly picked up the store phone and whispered for help. I then endured the most unnerving 10 minutes of my life as I waited. During this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room, which honestly added to my fear. For some reason, the man never came out to confront me. When 2 officers finally arrived and came inside, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed at the front, but I was shocked when they came out with nobody else. The man was gone. Watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, but outside were fresh tracks in the snow leading straight away from the gas station into the completely dark, empty field that stretched on for miles. Obviously, nobody could search that at night, but even when they did in the following days, they didn't find anything. The field was huge. He could have gone anywhere. It was so cold and windy that night that I was almost sure they'd find a body. The SUV was taken in for more information, but they couldn't find any history of ownership. We are still left with just what we know from that night: who the man was, what he was doing, and where he is now remain unsolved. I used to work at a restaurant with my older brother during our high school years. It was a small eatery in an outlet shopping center. We both worked as waiters, but since the place was small, we often helped out with various tasks like washing dishes, making deliveries, or whatever else was needed. After just a year, my brother graduated and decided to go to college, so he left the job. I continued working there for a few months before I eventually quit too. One Friday, I was working a later shift than usual. The restaurant stayed open until midnight, but because of school, I usually never stayed later than 8 or 9 p.m. However, I was scheduled to close this night alongside the manager. Everything was pretty normal, slowing down by 8 p.m., with only a few people picking up orders for the rest of the evening. At 10:30 p.m., my manager received a call for a delivery, and by 11 p.m., I was driving out of the parking lot. The address on the receipt was just 8 minutes away. A few minutes into the drive, my manager called. I answered, thinking the customer might have canceled, but apparently the guy had called back, saying he'd given the wrong address. I pulled over and wrote down the new address. When I typed it into the GPS, I realized it was 25 minutes away in the opposite direction of where I was going. If they had given this address initially, the order would never have been accepted. I thought about returning to the restaurant and informing my manager, knowing he would understand, but I was already out, and the order had been made, so I just started driving. The roads were mostly empty at this time of night, but as I drove further out, they became even emptier. For the last 5 minutes of the drive, I didn't see any other cars. I was on the outskirts of town where buildings and houses gave way to fields and trees. When I approached the road with the address, all I saw were a row of dark houses. As I drove past, a few had porch lights on, but it still felt deserted. These weren't the nicest houses either. They were all single-story, box-style homes. I pulled up to the one I was supposed to deliver to and parked on the side. Getting out with the food, I felt a strange, eerie sense as I walked up to the door. It was quiet outside, and with no street lights and barely any house lights, it was very dark. I knocked on the door and waited a whole minute with no signs of anyone being home. Feeling more uneasy, I set the bag down and turned to walk back to my car. The food hadn't been paid for yet, but it was probably cold, and I had no use for it. When I looked over at my car, a man was standing right behind it, leaned over as if he was looking into the window. I stopped, and the man immediately looked up at me. I could barely make out his face, but he was older. "Do you need something?" I asked, but the man didn't move. I asked again, but nothing changed. Feeling that eerie sense growing, I looked around but saw nothing but trees and darkness. The man took a few steps back, moving away from my car and standing maybe 5 feet from the door. I cautiously approached the car, hoping to just get in and leave. As I got right up to the door, the man continued to stare at me. I quickly got in and started the car, but before I could drive away, the guy started yelling. I looked over at him, seeing him now facing the woods and just screaming. I turned my head slightly and saw 2 or maybe 3 figures hurrying toward my car from the woods. My immediate thought was that this was a setup and I needed to leave instantly before something happened. I quickly reversed out just as the man next to me tried to move behind the car in an attempt to stop me. I sped away, hearing the group of men yelling at me as I drove off. The cops were called, and although not much was discovered, there were a few findings. The house I was to deliver to was a vacant property. It wasn't technically abandoned, but the owners didn't live in the state anymore. It wasn't for sale either. It had been left as is, rotting away for the past decade. The caller who placed the order is unknown, and the initial address he gave seemed to have no significance. Who the group was, what they planned to do, and many other things remain unresolved. I'll probably wonder about it for the rest of my life. After all, had anything played out even slightly differently, I might not be here right now. I used to work as an overnight lead at a retail store in my 20s. It wasn't a typical big chain grocery store. It was a local shop with about 8 or 9 locations. Most nights, I'd have an overnight stocker to assist, but it wasn't unusual for me to spend the whole shift alone. Since it wasn't a huge store, the work environment wasn't very intense. Often, I'd find myself working slowly just to avoid running out of tasks. This was one of those nights where I was alone, working at a steady pace. At the start of my shift, I loaded up some boxes and moved into the aisles to start stocking. It didn't require much mental effort, so my mind wandered, thinking about random things and not really paying attention. I went through about 3 aisles until a knock at the front entrance startled me. I almost didn't realize what it was because I was so spaced out. When I did, I got really confused. The person knocked again, loud enough to echo through the store. I walked to the end of the aisle and looked through the large front windows, seeing a man in a hoodie standing at the doors. I went up to the other side. "We're closed. Won't be open until 8 a.m., I said through the glass. The man looked at me, but didn't say anything. I pointed at the sign on the door. "We're closed. Sorry," I repeated. The man continued to stare at me for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. I watched him until I couldn't see him anymore, but it didn't look like he had parked anywhere. The whole thing was odd, to say the least, but I figured he was just at the wrong place or something. I went back to what I was doing, stocking the shelves and eventually forgetting about the man. By 2 a.m., I had gone through half of the aisles and was ready to take my lunch break. I left the boxes where they were and went to the break room on the other end of the building. I was in there for probably a good half hour before I tossed the rest of my lunch and went back to work. I walked through the store to the end of the aisle I had been working on, but just as I looked up, I saw a man walking past the other end. It looked like he was just walking across the store, not noticing me. I froze in place, feeling an instant rush of fear. Listening intently, I could hear the man's footsteps move toward the side of the building I had just come from, so I moved into the aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they went toward the break room, but just before I left the aisle to try and run for help, I heard the man rushing out of the room. The footsteps were now sprinting through the store, getting closer and closer. I ran for the front door, fumbling with my keys and trying to unlock it with shaky hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I got it open. As I stepped out of the building, I saw a bright flash out of the corner of my eye and heard a pop sound that made my ears ring, a gunshot. It was so loud, I didn't even know where it landed. I sprinted for my life around the building, making it to my car and hiding in the back seat as I called 911. From what I know, the man didn't follow me outside. He was gone by the time the police arrived, but they found the back door busted open with some heavy tools next to it. The most terrifying finding was the hole created by the gunshot, sitting right beside the front doors. The police believed it was a mental breakdown or psychotic break, with no real reason to target me specifically other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer work there, but for years following that incident, I was on edge every single night.